There are people, though, who would identify as right-wing or indeed even far-right. And no matter what humanity or community we put them in, they are set on destroying or pushing this toxicity. Do we think we can change their minds, or is it a case of building a society that doesn't include them?
Can you say that again? Just the way you said it.
Or is it a case of building a society that doesn't include them?
Zack Polanski, the actual leader of the Green Party, sits in his fancy studio and he speaks about democracy and fairness. But listen to what he drops. He asks if we should build a society completely excludes people who voted for Reform UK. Unbelievable. A politician paid by our tax money wants to delete half of the population from our society just because we do not agree with his open border fantasy. Let's play the tape, guys. It's bonkers.
Every now and then, we all have days where the rise of the far right, the kind of incompetence of this Labour government, and a general feeling of toxicity in the air kind of hangs on our shoulders. And if I'm being really honest with you, I'm having one of those days. So Zackia feels like the perfect guest. She's someone I've admired and loved for a long time. I can remember times during the pandemic and afterwards where I would just sit and listen to the tunes that she played, so often so soulful and mellow, full of her folk heroes and heroines. So I'm delighted that she's come on the podcast today to talk about her new book, Finding Albion. This is my conversation with DJ, writer, journalist and activist Zackia Soul. So one of the things that people say to me a lot is, how do you not find your job stressful? And most of the time, I just find it really hopeful and really inspiring, and people are doing amazing things. And then every so often I have a morning, like I've just had, where Reform are kind of pushing the most negative, xenophobic kind of policies. And I just feel like I need to cleanse. And then you've come into my life today, Zackia, and I feel like you're that amazing cleanse.
Polanski claims he needs a cleanse just because his rival party put a policy he does not agree with. I mean, it's like my 3-year-old son dropping a tantrum in the Tesco's. So yeah, every single leader, he faces problems, so he should face his voters, face different opinions. What he does instead, he runs to his safe space. Zackia. Let's watch another one.
Albion is the ancient name for Britain. So kind of in some of the earliest texts, you've got ancient Greek geographers referring to the island of Britain as Albion and distinguishing it from Ireland, today's Ireland, which they called Ivernia. So it's this kind of ancient word. Nobody really knows where it came from. Nobody really knows the true etymology of the word. Some people say it has a connection to the Latin word albus, meaning white. That could be the White Cliffs of Dover. Some people who have rather dark visions of Albion say that it's a reference to the white skin of Albion's true inhabitants. But it's a word that is sort of, because we don't really know exactly where it came from or what it means, it's a word that is sort of rich for dreaming about sort of alternatives for Britain. The incredible visionary and polymath William Blake wrote extensively about Albion, and he described Albion as a kind of primordial giant that sort of represented the soul of the nation. And Blake wrote that Albion had once contained all of heaven and earth in his limbs. He was this kind of great, majestic, cosmic being, and yet he'd fallen into a kind of deathly slumber. And Blake saw this as the consequence of the kind of rationalism and materialism and greed and religious dogma of his age. And yet he promised that the spirit of Albion would rise again to restore enchantment and hope and, to revitalize the nation. So my sense of Albion is very much kind of informed and influenced by Blake's. I see it as an alternative spirit of the nation, one that runs through certain aspects of our culture and in the landscape, that kind of rises up, I suppose, in times of need. And I would say that we are in one of those at the moment. And that's why I've gone sort of searching for visions of Albion in this book.
I love that so much. And so in the book, you're going around the country looking for stories of heroes and myths and folk legends. Are there any highlights? Obviously, people should read the book to get the real details, but are there any highlights where you thought, yes, this really feels right?
Well, perhaps it'd be good to start with one of the early legends of Albion. So in the book, as you mentioned, I'm kind of drawing on our older tales and customs and stories. I've always been really drawn to kind of folk culture because of the very different sort of vision of Britishness that we get when we look to some of these older customs and tales. When I started the research for this book, I was aware of a kind of famous legend of Albion written by the 12th century historian Geoffrey of Monmouth. And he, in his History of the Kings of Britain, I put history in inverted commas because although I think a lot of what he wrote was sort of believed up until the 17th century, we now see it as largely fictitious. He wrote about Albion being a land inhabited by a race of demonic giants until the arrival of the Trojan hero Brutus, who kind of came and wiped out the giants and colonized the land and named it Britain. But other scholars and poets, they wanted to fill in the gaps, and they asked, well, how did those giants get there? And then you end up with this very interesting story of Albina and her 30 sisters. And according to legend, Albina was the daughter of a sometimes Syrian, sometimes Greek king. And she and her 30 sisters were known for being extraordinarily beautiful, but also very disobedient. So they plot to murder their husbands in the night, and they are exiled. And they sail the 7 seas until they reach a beautiful uninhabited island, which Albina names Albion. So she and her sisters, they live in a kind of feminist utopia on this island for many years. They sort of commune with the land. Utopia. They learn to hunt its wild animals. They forage, and then, eventually they begin to pine for male company, and they procreate with some demons, and they give birth to the race of giants. Now, obviously, there are kind of some misogynistic sort of, ideas in that story, but I think that it's very, very fascinating that in some of the earliest stories about Britain and some of our kind of origin stories, we have this tale of immigrants, refugees from Syria, arriving on these shores to start a new life. And I think that, what would happen if we repurposed this myth, if we reclaimed this old myth, if we made Albina, made her a kind of symbol of Britishness? How might it kind of change the way we think about people arriving on these shores today?
That's quite bonkers, actually, because the guest of the Polanski's show claiming that potentially Britain was founded originally by the Syrian refugees. What? They're literally rewriting 12th century fiction to justify modern border failures. I've heard that before, I've seen that before, and I know where it leads. Believe me, that does not end well. Let's watch another one.
But it was also where I encountered a sense of national identity that felt welcoming rather than threatening. Even though me and my mum were like the only black faces around for miles when we visited, I used to kind of encounter these characters. They'd be singing Welsh hymns in the pubs, and you'd see the Welsh flag, the incredible red dragon sort of everywhere. But it never brought about a kind of fearful response in me in the same way that perhaps the St. George's Cross does. So in the book, I started to really question why that was. And I sort of was learning about the kind of flourishing of Welsh national consciousness in the 18th and 19th centuries that was largely a response to the Union of 1707. Wales had been in this kind of quasi-colonial relationship with England for many centuries beforehand. And after the Union, there was this attempt to really define Welshness in a way that it hadn't been before. And obviously, so this is a kind of national identity that was developed in opposition or almost kind of in defense against a kind of dominant neighbor. And there were poets and scholars and writers and aristocrats kind of really drawing for those older myths and symbols in their kind of attempts to conjure a kind of a sense of Welshness that could hold its own within the Union. So they looked to their old stories. Half the symbols that we associate with Wales today, the leek, the bard, the druid, the triple harp, these were kind of symbols that had their roots in older customs and stories, but they were really kind of held up as symbols of Welsh identity during that era. So although I had this sense that the kind of Welshness was sort of like this, or the kind of symbols of Welshness had just sort of sprung organically from the earth, in fact, the Welsh symbols as we know them today were collectively, consciously conjured. So, and the English never really did the same thing. I think that for a long time, Englishness was sort of enmeshed with the British project. So in many cases, our kind of British and English symbols are kind of merged or blended. It's quite hard to sort of distinguish them from one another. And Caroline Lucas writes about this very well in her book Another England, where she says it can be quite hard to sort of locate an Englishness as distinct from Britishness, and that is sort of a result of the British project. Whereas the Welsh and Scots have a very clear sense of who they are outside of Britishness, and I feel like the English don't in the same way.
I mean, so being English is not okay, but being Welsh and is okay. Scottish, apologies. So they praise every single identity on earth, but not their own. If you're born in England, you should be proud of that. Nope. Let's watch another one. It's getting better, lads.
There are people, though, who would identify as right-wing or indeed even far-right. And no matter what humanity or community we put them in, they are set on destroying or pushing this toxicity. Do we think we can change their minds? Or is it a case of building a society that doesn't include them?
This is the best one. So, leader of the Green Party just said that he wants to exclude third of the country just because our values do not match his values. How does that make sense? And he's the leader of the Green Party. Wow. So this is the true face of Westminster. Zack Polanski, leader of Green Party, he doesn't want to debate his opponents. What he wants to do is to build society where they don't even exist. Alright? They want your taxes, but they don't want your opinions. It makes my blood boil, guys. I'll see you in the next one.